So imagine you've lived your entire life in this massive, infinitely complex house.
Okay.
And you navigate all these endless hallways using this highly detailed blueprint, right? And you were basically handed this blueprint the day you were born.
Right, like a built-in guide.
Exactly. It tells you, where the load-bearing walls are, where the stairs lead, and most importantly, it tells you the grand purpose of every single room.
So you completely build your routines around this architectural truth.
Yeah, you just assume it's reality. But then one day, somebody just kicks the front door open, flips on these massive floodlights, and shows you that the blueprint you've been using was actually drawn in crayon by a toddler.
Oh.
Yeah, and the house is completely empty. There are no walls, no stairs, no purpose. It's just this vast, open, honestly terrifying space.
But instead of, adapting to that, you just keep walking around bumping into thin air, basically pretending the walls are still there.
Exactly. You just keep pretending.
Because, acknowledging that the walls are actually gone means you have to accept that you have to decide, literally in every given moment, which direction to walk.
Right. It's all on you.
Yeah, it means the structural integrity of your life wasn't provided by the house at all. It had to be generated entirely by you, and that is an agonizing level of responsibility.
It really is. And if you, the learner, have ever felt that creeping structural dread about, the potential meaninglessness of the universe.
Or if you felt strangely, maybe dangerously liberated by the idea that there's no cosmic plan.
Yes. Either way, this deep dive is basically going to dismantle the architecture of your reality, because today we are looking at existentialism, absurdism, and nihilism.
And we're not just skimming the surface here.
No, we have a really dense stack of sources today. We're pulling from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, some really deep literary analyses from lit charts, historical frameworks from Philosophy Break, The Collector, Academy of Ideas.
Excellence reporter, too.
Right, and even a live, ongoing debate from the existentialism subreddit, which just goes to show these aren't just dead academic theories, They're active survival mechanisms for the modern mind.
They absolutely are. And our mission today is to fundamentally decode Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, and Jean-Paul Sartre.
Because, the popular cultural image of these guys is usually them smoking French cigarettes in some dimly lit Parisian cafe.
Just wallowing in despair, declaring that nothing matters.
Exactly, just being super depressing. But that reading is entirely backwards, isn't it?
It really is. We're going to break down the actual mechanics of things like the death of God, the friction of the absurd, and the radical burden of existence preceding essence.
To show you how these concepts are actually really proactive frameworks for freedom.
So where do we start?
Let's start by looking at the exact moment that blueprint was torn up. We need to go back to 1882.
Ah, right. Friedrich Nietzsche's The Gay Science.
Yes. This is the origin point of arguably the most famous and definitely the most catastrophically misunderstood soundbite in all of Western philosophy.
God is dead.
God is dead. But the context of that phrase, it changes everything about what it actually means, right?
Completely. Nietzsche delivers this whole concept through a parable about a madman.
Right.
So it's morning, bright daylight out, yet this madman lights a lantern, runs into the town marketplace, and just starts screaming incessantly, "I seek God! I seek God!"
Now, if you think this is some triumphant declaration of atheism like it's so often portrayed today, you'd probably expect this madman to be crashing a church service, right?
Yeah, yelling at bishops or devout believers trying to shatter their worldview.
Exactly. But Nietzsche specifically points out that the marketplace is full of unbelievers. These are atheists.
Right, the educated, secular elite of the 19th century.
And their reaction is so vital to understanding the whole existential crisis.
Yeah.
Because they don't react with shock or anger.
Not at all. They mock him. They just laugh condescendingly.
Yeah, they ask, has he got lost? Did he lose his way like a child? Is he hiding from us?
It reads exactly like the kind of sarcastic, culturally superior attitude you might see today, in a debate with modern rationalists or new atheists.
Totally. The crowd represents this smug, modernist, scientifically literate mindset. They think religion is just this silly, outdated fairy tale that humanity has finally outgrown.
They think the death of God is just like a clerical update, a triumph of human intelligence that frees us up to just be rational, happy consumers.
But Nietzsche's madman, he just jumps right into the middle of them, pierces them with his eyes, and delivers the actual terrifying weight of what's happening.
Yeah, he says God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers?
The madman is not celebrating at all.
No, he is absolutely panicked.
Because God, in this specific philosophical context, it doesn't just mean a literal bearded man in the clouds. It's structural.
Right. God represents the entire concept of objective, universal, transcendent truth.
It's like the ultimate Jenga block at the very bottom of the tower that holds up our entire Judeo-Christian moral architecture.
And if you pull that block out, you don't just lose theology, you lose the foundation for human rights, for objective morality.
The inherent value of a human life, even.
Exactly. That is the mechanical failure Nietzsche is diagnosing here. A much more accurate translation of his horror would be, truth is dead.
Right, because you can't just systematically dismantle the ultimate cosmic authority that legitimized your moral values and then expect those same values to just hover in midair supported by nothing.
The madman is trying to warn these smug atheists that they've essentially unchained the earth from its sun, and they don't even realize they're plunging into the dark.
And the inevitable result of that plunge, according to the Breakdown of Philosophy Break, is nihilism. It's this devouring vacuum.
Because if there's no objective moral structure, if the universe is entirely indifferent to human suffering or triumph, society risks collapsing into total apathy.
Yeah, like if nothing matters objectively, why build anything? Why love anyone?
Why not just lie down and let the void take over?
Exactly. So Nietzsche diagnosed the historical and cultural death of objective truth. But it was Albert Camus, decades later, who diagnosed the psychological sensation of actually living in the aftermath of that death.
Right. Camus gave a name to the feeling of waking up in a universe that absolutely refuses to explain itself. He called it the absurd.
And I really want to spend some time defining the absurd, because the way we use that word colloquially totally ruins its philosophical power.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if I say a movie plot is absurd, I mean, it's goofy or illogical, but for Camus, the absurd is not a property of the universe itself. The universe isn't absurd.
No, a rock is just a rock. A star is just a ball of burning gas.
Exactly. The absurd is a friction. It's a relational dynamic.
It requires two opposing components colliding. So on one side, you have the human mind. We are evolutionarily and psychologically hardwired with this desperate yearning for unity.
Right. We have this insatiable appetite for absolute clarity, for narrative purpose, for a reason why things happen. We desperately want the universe to make sense.
And on the other side?
On the other side is what Camus brilliantly terms the unreasonable silence of the world.
Yeah.
We stand on the edge of the void and we scream, why am I here? What is the purpose of my suffering? And the universe simply echoes the question back at us.
And the absurd is born in that exact moment of confrontation. It's that irreconcilable gap between our demand for meaning and the cold, indifferent silence of reality.
So the lit charts analysis of Camus's essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, actually shows how this friction manifests in daily life, because it doesn't usually happen when you're like sitting around reading a philosophy book.
No, it happens in the middle of the most mundane routines.
Camus paints this devastatingly accurate picture of the waking slumber of modern life. You get up, you take the streetcar, you work 4 hours in the office, you eat.
You work 4 more hours, you eat, you sleep. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Just following the rhythm automatically, you're operating under the assumption that there is a point to all of it.
You assume the blueprint from your analogy is real.
Exactly. Until the day the why arises. You're standing on the subway platform staring at the fluorescent lights, or you're sitting at your desk looking at a spreadsheet, and the stage set just collapses.
The mechanics of your life are suddenly stripped of their assumed meaning.
You're struck by this weariness tinged with amazement, realizing you're doing all of this just to maintain a biological machine that's inevitably going to break down and die anyway.
The Academy of Ideas source uses a really fantastic mythological parallel for this exact sensation. They compare the human condition under the absurd to Tantalus from Greek mythology.
Oh, right. Tantalus.
Yeah, he was condemned to stand in a pool of water in the underworld with a branch of delicious fruit hanging just inches above his head.
But every time he reached up to grab the fruit to satisfy his hunger, the wind would just blow the branch out of reach.
And every time he bent down to drink the water, to soothe his parched throat, the water would just recede into the ground.
That is exactly what the quest for objective meaning feels like. We're forever reaching for ultimate answers, spiritual comforts, cosmic reassurance.
But the closer we look, the more science or philosophy we apply, the more those ultimate answers recede. We are left eternally thirsty.
And realizing that you're trapped in that pool of water is a profoundly destabilizing trauma.
It really is.
When human beings encounter the sheer terror of the absurd, their immediate, deeply ingrained instinct is to look for an exit. We cannot stand the tension. We want out of the pool.
Which brings us right to the concept of philosophical suicide and bad faith.
Camus famously opens the myth of Sisyphus with what has to be the most intense hook in modern philosophy. He says, there is only one really serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide.
He's not just being dramatic for the sake of it either.
No, he's asking a purely logical question. If we've diagnosed that life is inherently absurd, that there's no grand meaning, and that all our striving just ends in the absolute annihilation of death.
Does reason dictate that we should just kill ourselves and skip the exhausting middle part? Does the absurd require physical death?
He treats it as a genuine, rigorous question, but he ultimately rejects physical suicide completely.
Yeah, for Camus, physical suicide is a surrender. It's allowing the absurd to crush you. It eliminates the friction by just eliminating one of the components, the human mind.
But he's equally hostile to another kind of escape, one that he views as far more insidious, which he calls philosophical suicide.
If physical suicide is killing the body to escape the absurd, philosophical suicide is killing your own rationality. It's killing your lucidity.
Okay, break that down for me. How does that work?
Well, philosophical suicide happens when you recognize the terrifying silence of the universe. You feel the existential dread, but instead of holding your ground and living with your eyes open, you flinch.
You look away.
Exactly. You take a blind leap into unverified hope or faith. You invent a beyond to justify the suffering of the present.
The most obvious example being traditional religion, right? You decide the silence of this world doesn't matter because this life is just a temporary waiting room.
Right. The real meaning is in an eternal afterlife, in heaven, where God will finally explain the blueprint.
But religion wasn't his only target.
No, religion is the primary target. But Camus actually aimed his harshest critiques at his own contemporaries. Fellow existentialist thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, Karl Jaspers, and Martin Heidegger.
Because they also diagnosed the void.
Exactly. He analyzed their work and found that they all expertly diagnosed the terrifying, meaningless void of the universe. They walked right up to the edge of the cliff.
But then they got dizzy.
Yeah, they took a leap of faith. They essentially deified the very void that crushed them. They tried to find a transcendent, magical cure for an incurable structural human condition.
And Camus viewed that as intellectual cowardice.
He absolutely did.
But let's bring this into the 21st century for the learner. Because if you ask the average person today how they find objective truth, they aren't going to cite Kierkegaard or the church.
No, they're going to point to a laboratory.
Right. They're going to say, science gives us objective truth. Science fills the void.
And this is where we really have to look closely at Nietzsche's The Genealogy of Morality,
Right.
because he actually foresaw this exact pivot.
But we need to draw a really strict line here.
Yes,
Yeah.
very strict. Nietzsche was not anti-science. He was not a Luddite. He deeply respected the rigorous empirical work of actual scientists.
So what was he attacking?
What he viciously attacked was scientism as an ideology.
Scientism, the elevation of the scientific method into a new dogmatic religion.
Yes, scientism is the cultural belief that science can eventually answer all questions of human value, morality, and meaning.
And Nietzsche argued that this blind faith in a completely objective world of absolute facts is really just the latest mutated strain of what he called the ascetic ideal. And the ascetic ideal is essentially a philosophy of self-denial. It's the belief that the true reality is always some pristine, transcendental realm that exists entirely separate from our messy, physical, emotional, earthly experience.
Historically, Christianity placed that true reality in a spiritual heaven.
Right, and scientism just shifts the geography. It places the true reality in a realm of microscopic particles, invisible forces, and mathematical equations that are completely divorced from human lived experience.
Precisely. So when you reduce a human being's love for their child to nothing more than a neurochemical fluctuation of oxytocin and dopamine, you're practicing the ascetic ideal.
You're stripping the lived, messy, beautiful experience of its human value in favor of a cold, objective fact.
And Nietzsche warns that if we rely on scientism to give us our moral compass, we still haven't faced the void. We've just replaced the priest with the physicist, but we're still outsourcing our meaning to a realm we don't control.
And if we refuse to face that void, if we refuse to take on the terrifying burden of creating our own values, Nietzsche had this prophetic chilling vision of what humanity would regress into. He called it the last man.
which he details in Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Right. And the last man is basically the ultimate manifestation of avoiding the absurd through sedation.
If creating meaning is too painful, the last man simply decides to stop trying to mean anything at all.
The psychology of the last man is uncomfortably familiar today. He is entirely apathetic. He avoids all danger, all risk, all grand ambition.
He invents a little poison for pleasant dreams.
Yeah, the text literally says the last man believes work is merely an entertainment, just a way to pass the time, and they just blink their eyes and say, "We have discovered happiness."
They have no great passions. They produce no high art. They have no desire to strive for anything beyond mere comfortable survival.
It's the ultimate tragic numbing of the human spirit. It's essentially doom scrolling through a meaningless existence until you quietly expire.
It really is. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre approached this exact same evasion of responsibility, but he framed it through the lens of absolute freedom.
Because for Sartre, human beings are fundamentally structurally free. There's no human nature, no destiny, no cosmic script.
But when we actually realize the staggering, infinite weight of that freedom, it triggers a profound psychological reaction that Sartre called anguish.
And we need to differentiate anguish from, everyday anxiety.
Absolutely. Anxiety is worrying about whether you'll get the job or if you left the stove on. Anguish, in the Sartrean sense, is structural pain.
The lit chart's sources clarify this beautifully. Anguish isn't a paralysis that stops you from acting. Anguish is the very condition of your action.
It's the terrifying vertigo you feel when you realize that whatever you choose to do next, there is absolutely nothing forcing your hand.
You are writing the code of reality as you execute it, and you're entirely, inescapably responsible for the outcome.
And because humans desperately want to escape that vertigo, Sartre says we commit bad faith.
Which is the cornerstone of his whole existentialist philosophy.
The mechanics of bad faith are simple but profound. It is the act of lying to yourself about your own freedom.
You pretend that you're an object rather than a free subject.
Exactly. You blame your choices on outside forces to insulate yourself from the anguish of responsibility.
So you say things like, "I had to yell at my partner because of my childhood trauma," or "I couldn't help cheating. Human nature is biologically wired for infidelity."
Or, "I'm just a cog in the corporate machine. I can't possibly change my career." You treat yourself as a passive mechanism operating on a track.
The lit chart source highlights one of Sartre's most brilliant anecdotes to illustrate this. It comes from his time detained in a German prisoner of war camp during World War II.
Right, where he met a Jesuit priest.
Yeah, and Sartre dug into this man's history. Before the war, this man had essentially failed at every secular endeavor he attempted.
He had failed his academic exams. He'd suffered humiliating rejections in his romantic relationships. He was impoverished. He had no career prospects.
So, how does the man process this total secular collapse? He tells Sartre that he interpreted all of these continuous, painful failures as a sign from God.
He decided God was closing all the secular doors because he was divinely destined to join the Jesuit priesthood and live a spiritual life.
And Sartre's dissection of this is just devastatingly sharp. He doesn't just call the man a liar, he analyzes the architecture of the man's self-deception.
Sartre points out that the man chose to interpret those specific failures as a divine sign. He wasn't forced by the universe to read the data that way. He was the sole author of the sign's meaning.
Right, because he could have looked at those exact same academic and romantic failures and decided, this is a sign that I need to study harder.
Or, this is a sign I should abandon academia and become a carpenter.
Or even, this is a sign that the bourgeois societal structures are corrupt and I must become a violent political revolutionary.
But he didn't. He chose the interpretation that completely absolved him of his own failures.
By claiming God destined me for this, he masked his total freedom of choice and his responsibility for his previous failures behind the illusion of divine intervention. That is bad faith in its purest form.
Think about it like driving a car.
Okay, I love this analogy. Let's do it.
Bad faith is basically driving your car directly into a lake, but refusing to admit you did it. You point at the GPS on the dashboard and scream, "The satellite told me to turn right. The machine made me do it."
You do this to avoid the terrifying, undeniable reality that your hands were gripped tightly around the steering wheel the entire time. You drove the car into the water. The GPS was just a screen.
That analogy cuts right to the core of it. Nietzsche, Camus, and Sartre are systematically ripping the GPS out of the dashboard.
They're tearing down the religious blueprints, the scientism, the bad faith excuses.
But And this is the crucial turning point in their philosophies. They do not leave us sitting in the wreckage of the car, drowning in the lake.
No, they don't just diagnose the disease. They actually offer a prescription. They provide proactive, radical frameworks for how to grip that steering wheel without panicking.
So let's look at the solutions, starting with Nietzsche. If the old values are dead, if the GPS is gone, what do we actually do?
We have to become our own determiners of value, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If there is no overarching truth, we must step into the void and generate our own. This is where Nietzsche introduces his concept of the Übermensch.
Which roughly translates to the Overman or Superman. But I am going to throw the brakes on right here because we absolutely must set the historical record straight.
Yes, we really do.
This is perhaps the most tragic, violent distortion of any philosophical concept in human history, because when you say Übermensch, a massive portion of the audience immediately thinks of Nazi Germany, eugenics, and Aryan supremacy.
And we have to explicitly clarify how that horrific misappropriation happened, because it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate forgery.
Walk us through that. What happened?
Well, in 1889, Nietzsche suffered a complete psychological collapse. He lost his mind and spent the last decade of his life completely incapacitated.
And during this time, his sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, took control of his estate and his vast archive of unpublished notes.
And Elizabeth was a fervent German nationalist who happened to be married to a prominent, virulent anti-Semite.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she literally went through his notebooks, cut up his writings, spliced them together out of context, and published a mangled, heavily edited book called The Will to Power.
Which was specifically designed to make Nietzsche's philosophy align with her abhorrent, proto-fascist political ideology.
Exactly. And this forged version was later adopted by the Nazi Party.
So let's be unequivocally clear on Nietzsche's actual stances for the learner. He violently detested German nationalism.
He was fiercely critical of the German state.
He absolutely despised anti-Semitism. He famously wrote in a letter that he would like to have all anti-Semites shot.
The Nazis took a philosophy of radical individual liberation and twisted it into a doctrine of biological collective tyranny.
So for Nietzsche himself, the Übermensch had absolutely nothing to do with genetics or race or collective state power.
Nothing at all. It was an individual, psychological, and deeply creative triumph. The Übermensch is someone who can look at the terrifying void of a meaningless universe, stare down the absurd, master their own chaotic inner passions, and forge a brilliant, entirely original life.
He compared it to a Renaissance artist tyrant, right? Someone who sculpts their own character out of the raw material of existence.
Yes, it's a massive shift toward what he called this worldliness.
Meaning instead of rejecting the physical world and holding out for a promised heaven like the ascetic ideal, the Übermensch fiercely loves the earth.
They embrace the pain, the tragedy, and the joy of existence, and they create their own life-affirming values from scratch.
Which obviously requires immense strength.
It does. Now, Camus takes a different approach to solving the absurd. He doesn't ask us to become artist tyrants. He gives us the absurd hero.
And his ultimate avatar for this is Sisyphus. We all know the basic myth, right? Sisyphus completely pisses off the gods, and his punishment in the underworld is eternal, futile labor.
He has to heave a massive, crushing boulder at the side of a steep mountain.
And every single time he sweats, bleeds, and finally gets the rock to the very peak, the boulder inevitably slips from his grasp and rolls all the way back down to the valley floor.
And he has to walk back down and start over. Forever.
It is the purest distillation of the absurd. It's just a picture of total despair.
Yet, Camus concludes his essay with an incredibly provocative statement. He says, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy."
I mean, how does that mechanically work? How can a man whose entire existence is defined by pointless, agonizing torment actually experience happiness?
The secret to Camus's philosophy lies entirely in the descent. The struggle up the mountain is just physical labor, but Camus focuses on the moment the rock rolls away and Sisyphus turns around to walk back down to the valley.
And Camus calls this walk the hour of consciousness.
Because during that walk, he isn't distracted by the physical effort. He is alone with his thoughts. Right. When Sisyphus is walking down, he is not operating under any illusions. He isn't hoping that maybe this time the rock will stay at the top. He isn't praying for the gods to forgive him.
He's fully, brutally lucid.
Exactly. He's entirely aware of the wretched, crushing futility of his fate. But in that total awareness, he embraces his fate without a single shred of resignation.
By accepting his punishment completely, by refusing to hope for an escape, he actually robs the gods of their power to torment him.
Yes. The tragedy requires his despair. If he refuses to despair, the punishment fails. As Camus writes, his rock is his thing.
He claims ownership of his struggle. The absurd universe dictates that his labor is meaningless, but Sisyphus rebels by making the labor his own.
And Camus expands on this deeply in his early lyrical essays set in Algeria, like Nuptials.
What does he argue in those essays?
He argues that by giving up the exhausting, deceptive hope for a future afterlife, we suddenly unlock the ability to experience the intense, physical, sensuous beauty of this exact present moment.
He describes wandering through the ancient Roman ruins of Tapasa, right?
Yes. And he doesn't look for spiritual transcendence there. He focuses on the intense heat of the sun on his skin, the sharp smell of the absinthe plants, the vast, overwhelming blue of the Mediterranean Sea, the taste of warm stone.
It's a philosophy of limits. You only get one life. It is guaranteed to end in total annihilation. There's no sequel.
So you better feel the sun on your skin while you still have skin.
Exactly. You better drink the wine and feel the cold water of the ocean. The lack of eternal meaning doesn't devalue the present. It hypercharges it.
Its visceral presence as a form of rebellion against death. Now, if we move to Sartre, his solution to gripping the steering wheel gives us the most famous, defining catchphrase of the entire existentialist movement.
Existence precedes essence.
Yes. And to explain the mechanics of this, we have to use Sartre's famous analogy of the paper knife, or the letter opener.
Okay, so if a craftsman decides to make a paper knife, he starts with a concept. He knows what the object's purpose is to open envelopes.
He knows what materials are required. The idea, the purpose, the blueprint of the knife exists in the creator's mind long before the physical object is ever manufactured.
So for the paper knife, its essence, its purpose and fundamental definition strictly precedes its existence. It is created to fulfill a pre-existing meaning.
And for thousands of years, humanity fundamentally believed that we were exactly like the paper knife. We believe that a divine creator designed us with a specific, overarching purpose in mind.
But if Nietzsche's right, if God is dead, if there is no creator drawing up blueprints, then the formula for human beings is reversed. Existence precedes essence.
We exist first. We simply show up in the world. We are thrown into existence randomly, biologically, without a predetermined blueprint, without a built-in purpose.
Without a defined human nature constraining us, we're just here.
Right.
But wait, if existence precedes essence, does that mean our biology, our genetics, or historical circumstances play no role at all? Because that feels, I don't know, scientifically illiterate. Like if I'm born with a certain genetic disease or in a specific war-torn country, I'm not a blank slate.
Sartre isn't denying biological or historical facts. He actually has a specific term for those constraints. He calls it facticity.
Facticity.
Yes, your facticity includes your body, your past, your socioeconomic starting point. But Sartre argues that your facticity does not dictate your essence. Your essence is how you choose to respond to those facts.
Okay, so a genetic disease is a fact, but whether you let it make you bitter or whether you use it to become a compassionate doctor is your freely chosen essence.
Exactly. Because we have no predetermined essence, we are entirely, radically responsible for defining our own essence through our actions.
Sartre put it pretty bluntly, didn't he? Man is nothing other than what he makes of himself.
Yes, and this ongoing process of self-definition is what he calls the human project.
But critics at the time, particularly Catholic thinkers and Marxists, they attacked this concept relentlessly. They called it a deeply pessimistic, depressing philosophy.
They argued that being abandoned in a meaningless universe with no moral safety net is just a recipe for absolute despair.
But Sartre fiercely countered that it's actually the most wildly optimistic philosophy in human history.
And he's right, mathematically speaking. Yes, it means that if you are a coward, you are fully 100% guilty of your cowardice. You can't blame your genetics, your terrible childhood, or society. You chose to act cowardly.
But the flip side of that radical responsibility is radical freedom.
Exactly. It means you are never permanently trapped by your past. Because your essence is always under construction, you have the absolute power to wake up tomorrow and choose to act bravely.
You are only a coward until the exact moment you choose to be a hero.
Right.
Think of it like this. If essence preceded existence, we'd just be following a strict recipe handed to us by a head chef. We'd just be measuring ingredients. But because existence precedes essence, we are the chefs.
We're stuck in the kitchen with a random assortment of ingredients, our facticity.
And Sartre says life is nothing until it is lived. We have to invent the dish from scratch. The burden is entirely on us. But here is the critical pivot in the philosophy. We aren't the only ones in the kitchen. There are billions of other chefs in the room.
And this is where existentialism evolves. It moves from being a philosophy of the isolated, burdened individual into a philosophy of the collective human condition. It becomes about solidarity.
How do our individual, radically free choices affect everyone else?
Well, Sartre had a specific term for the structural reality that our freedoms are linked. He called it intersubjectivity.
And I really want to dig into intersubjectivity because it solves the main critique of existentialism, that it's just selfish individualism.
Sartre argued that our absolute subjective freedom does not isolate us. It inherently binds us to every other human being.
Yeah.
Because there is no God to hand down a moral code, no objective good written in the stars. Every single time you make a choice, you aren't just deciding what is right for you.
You're making a universal declaration.
Exactly. By choosing an action, you are stating to the universe, this is what a human being should do in this situation.
So when you choose to marry or to join a union or even to lie on your taxes, you're creating an image of man as you believe he ought to be.
You become, in Sartre's words, a moral legislator for all mankind. The weight of your choice falls not just on your shoulders, but on the concept of humanity itself.
To make this abstract weight incredibly concrete, Litcharts brings up a famous story Sartre told about a student who came to him for advice during the brutal Nazi occupation of France in World War II.
Right. The student was trapped in an agonizing, impossible dilemma.
Yeah. His older brother had been killed in the German offensive of 1940. His father was a traitor collaborating with the Germans. So the student lived alone with his aging mother, who was deeply traumatized and absolutely devoted to him. He was literally her only reason for continuing to live.
If he left her, he was certain she would die of grief. That's his immediate personal reality.
But simultaneously, the student intensely desired to flee to England, join the Free French forces under de Gaulle, and fight the Nazis to liberate his entire country from fascist tyranny.
It is the ultimate moral deadlock. Does he stay and provide certain immediate comfort to one specific person he loves? Or does he leave, risking his mother's death, to fight for the abstract, greater good of an entire nation, knowing he might just be killed in transit and achieve nothing?
The student comes to Sartre because the traditional blueprints, the GPS systems we talked about, are completely broken in this scenario.
They offer no help at all.
Right. If he tries to use Kantian ethics, which states treat people as ends in themselves, never as means, he's stuck. If he goes to fight, he treats his mother as a means to an end. If he stays with his mother, he treats his fellow Frenchmen bleeding on the front lines as a means to his own personal comfort.
And if he turns to Christian doctrine, which says love your neighbor and be charitable, he's still paralyzed. Who is the true neighbor requiring charity? The mother sitting weeping in the kitchen, or the occupied nation?
The doctrines are totally useless. They cannot generate the correct choice. So when the student asked Sartre what the right choice was, what did Sartre tell him?
Sartre told him the most terrifying, liberating truth possible. He said, you are free, therefore choose. That is to say, invent.
Wow.
He told the student that no sign in the world, no philosophy, and no priest could make the decision for him. He had to invent his own morality through the physical act of choosing. Whatever action he took would become his moral truth. He had to bear the weight of legislating that morality.
And this immediately triggers the most common pushback against Sartre, because if everyone is just inventing their own morality through action, if there is no objective scale of good and evil, doesn't that lead to total moral relativism?
That's the fear, yeah.
Yeah.
How can we possibly judge anyone else? Could a tyrant simply choose to build a concentration camp and say, well, I invented my morality, and in my morality, this is right, so you can't judge me?
This is a crucial defense of existentialism. Sartre says we absolutely can judge others, but we don't judge them based on an archaic, objective scale of cosmic good and evil. We judge them on the mechanics of bad faith.
We judge whether they are acting authentically, with a full, terrifying awareness of their own freedom, or if they are lying to themselves and hiding behind determinism.
Right. And furthermore, Sartre argues that freedom is the foundational requirement for any value to exist at all. Therefore, to truly value your own freedom, you logically must value the freedom of others.
Because if someone's invented morality involves systematically denying the freedom of other human beings, which is exactly what fascism, slavery, and tyranny do, Sartre argues that action is inherently logically contradictory.
It's operating in deep bad faith.
Exactly, because it relies on the tyrant's freedom to destroy the foundation of freedom itself. We can absolutely condemn the tyrant, not because they violated God's law, but because they violated the structural logic of human freedom.
That's a huge distinction. Now, Camus also wrestled deeply with this transition from the individual surviving the absurd to the collective human family trying to survive history.
For Camus, the evolution went from the isolated, absurd hero pushing a rock to what he called metaphysical rebellion.
Descartes famously founded modern philosophy with the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," but Camus updated that for the existential age in a pretty profound way.
He wrote, "I rebel, therefore we exist."
Notice the pronoun shift there. It moves from the I of rebellion to the we of existence.
For Camus, rebellion is the fundamental refusal to be broken by the absurd.
Hmm.
But true rebellion, he argues, must inherently respect human dignity.
So when an oppressed person finally stands up and says no to a master, they aren't just fighting for their own individual physical comfort.
No, they are implicitly declaring that there is a limit. They are saying there is something within all human beings, a shared dignity that is worth fighting for, worth preserving against the void.
But history shows us that rebellion rarely stays pure, right? Rebellion often turns incredibly bloody, and the oppressed frequently become the new oppressors.
Camus addressed this head-on in his massive controversial book, The Rebel. He critiqued how the quest for justice in the 20th century so often morphed into what he called logical crime.
Calculated ideological mass murder.
And here we really must look at the specific historical target of his critique. Because in The Rebel, Camus directed a severe, intellectually devastating critique at Marxism and Soviet communism. He argued that these ideologies functioned exactly like the religious leaps of faith he despised.
They promised a future, perfect, classless utopia at the end of history.
Yes.
And it's really worth noting here for the learner because we are looking objectively at Camus' historical writings and the philosophical mechanics of his argument. We're not taking a modern political stance on left versus right ideologies ourselves. That Camus was targeting the specific logic used by 20th century regimes.
Right. He argued that because this imagined Marxist future was mathematically guaranteed by historical materialism, and because it was so glorious, the revolutionaries believed that any means were justified to achieve it.
Exactly. If your ideology promises eternal utopia for all future generations, then liquidating a few million dissidents, setting up gulags, and instituting state terror in the present moment seems like a mathematically acceptable price to pay.
Camus argued that sacrificing living, breathing, suffering human beings in the present for the sake of an imagined, abstract, theoretical future was just a dangerous new religion.
It was nihilistic destruction masquerading as historical justice. It violated the very human dignity that rebellion was supposed to protect.
So if historical rebellion leads to gulags and philosophical suicide leads to religious evasion, how is Camus suggesting we actually fight the absurd alongside our fellow humans without becoming murderers?
He illustrates his answer beautifully, not in a dense philosophical essay, but in a novel, The Plague.
A book that experienced a massive, totally understandable resurgence in recent years.
Oh, for sure. It's set in the coastal Algerian city of Oran, which is suddenly inexplicably overwhelmed by a deadly outbreak of the bubonic plague.
The city is locked down, quarantined, death is everywhere, striking completely randomly.
The plague is the ultimate visceral manifestation of the absurd. It's a random, meaningless, terrifying slaughter of innocents that no one can fully control.
And the characters in the novel represent the different philosophical responses to the absurd we've discussed today.
Right. You have Father Panelu, the Jesuit priest, who preaches a fiery sermon claiming that the plague is a righteous punishment from God for the city's sins, and he demands that the citizens submit to the divine will.
He represents the religious escape, trying to force a meaning onto meaningless suffering. But the central focal point of the novel is the atheist physician, Dr. Rio.
Dr. Rio doesn't rely on grand, sweeping heroism. He doesn't rely on historical materialism or God. He just organizes sanitary squads to go into the worst parts of the city, treat the sick, lance the boils, and respectfully dispose of the dead.
It's grueling, dangerous, endless work. And at one point, another character asks Rio why he is risking his life day after day doing this if he doesn't believe in God and he doesn't believe in a grand cosmic purpose.
And Rio's answer is the defining thesis of Thomas' collective philosophy. He says, there's no question of heroism in all this. It's a matter of common decency. That's an idea which may make some people smile, but the only means of fighting a plague is common decency.
Common decency. It sounds so modest, almost anticlimactic after discussing Übermenschen and grand metaphysical rebellion.
But it is incredibly powerful in its modesty.
It really is. It means you just do your job. You relieve human suffering wherever you can, in the present moment, in solidarity with your fellow human beings, without expecting a cosmic reward, and without sacrificing them for a future utopia.
You fight the plague simply because the plague is the enemy of human life. So if I synthesize this shift from the individual to the collective, it seems like Sartre focuses heavily on the weight of our connection, how my individual choices structurally define the morality of all humanity, making me responsible for the image of man.
Right.
And Camus, on the other hand, focuses on the warmth of our connection, how our shared vulnerability and suffering in an absurd, silent world bonds us together in a trench of solidarity.
There's an excellent distillation of their different approaches to the same void.
But I want to bring this out of 1940s occupied France and into the present moment for the learner. How do these incredibly heavy historical concepts actually apply to the way people, specifically younger generations, view the world today? Are we still fighting the plague?
To answer that, we can turn directly to the Reddit debate from the Our Existentialism subreddit that was included in our source stack. It provides a fascinating window into how these philosophies haven't died. They've mutated to adapt to modern internet culture.
Yeah, the thread features a really vibrant debate comparing classic existentialism with a rapidly growing modern trend called optimistic nihilism. This is a phrase you see everywhere on YouTube essays and TikToks now.
Let's define the terms precisely based on the Reddit consensus. One of the users in the thread actually wrote a Python script to visualize the philosophical difference, mapping out meaning versus obligation.
That's amazing.
It is. So, optimistic nihilism starts with the exact same premise as classic nihilism. The universe is objectively meaningless. We're just cosmic dust on a rock hurtling through a cold void. There is no inherent value to anything we do.
But instead of falling into the despair of Nietzsche's Last Man or the panic of the madman, optimistic nihilism treats this realization of meaninglessness as a profoundly liberating free pass.
Exactly. The logical flow goes like this. If nothing matters on a cosmic scale, then my mistakes don't matter. My embarrassments don't matter.
If the universe doesn't care about me, then there are no cosmic obligations weighing me down. Therefore, I am completely free to just pursue whatever makes my brain release the most serotonin.
It's a very carefree, slightly hedonistic, incredibly individualistic approach. It's highly focused on self-exploration, stress reduction, and enjoying the ride simply because the ride goes absolutely nowhere.
Classic existentialism, however, as we spent the last hour unpacking from Sartre and Camus, demands significantly more from the individual. It also accepts the meaningless universe. It accepts the lack of a blueprint.
But it emphatically does not view that void as a free pass to just play in the sandbox. Existentialism replaces the cosmic void not with carefree hedonism, but with radical obligation and discipline.
Let me build out an analogy for this because I think it clarifies the stakes for the learner listening right now. Think about modern video games.
Okay.
Optimistic nihilism is like playing a massive open-world game in sandbox mode or God mode. You have infinite health, infinite resources. Nothing really matters. There are no real consequences. So you just have fun building weird houses, blowing up cars, and exploring the map until you get bored and turn the console off.
It's fun, but it's shallow.
Right. And how would you frame existentialism in this analogy?
Existentialism is playing the exact same game, but on ultra-hardcore survival mode. But with a twist. You have to write the underlying code of the game's morality engine as you play it. And if your character gets hurt, you genuinely feel the pain. Every single choice has permanent consequences that affect all the other players on the server.
Which mode actually provides a richer, more meaningful experience?
If we channel Camus and Sartre to critique this Reddit debate, they would likely view modern optimistic nihilism as dangerously incomplete. They would argue it misses the necessary revolt and the necessary anguish required to live a truly deep, authentic human life.
Because optimistic nihilism is focused primarily inward. It's about my happiness, my stress relief, my ability to stop worrying about the void.
Yes, it flirts with bad faith by trying to shrug off the weight of existence. Existentialism demands that you look the void in the eye, that you carry the immense weight of your choices without making excuses, that you construct an authentic self through rigorous action, and most importantly, that you act in compassionate solidarity with others who are suffering.
Without the struggle, without the agonizing push of Sisyphus's boulder up the mountain, the happiness of the descent might be a bit hollow.
It really might.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. We have journeyed through some incredibly heavy, structurally complex terrain today. We started by exploring the terrifying realization of the death of objective truth with Nietzsche's panicked madman.
We felt the crushing relational friction of the absurd with Camus.
And we learned how to grip the steering wheel and carry the immense, terrifying weight of our absolute freedom with Sartre.
We've dismantled the blueprints, but we've seen that while the universe may not offer us a pre-written destiny, it offers us a blank canvas. And we have the tools to paint it.
Exactly. You, the learner, are not trapped by human nature. You are not trapped by the historical facticity of your past, by some invisible destiny, or by the alignment of the stars. You are the radical architect of your own essence.
But before we sign off, I think we have one last thing to consider.
Yes, I want to leave you with a final, unaddressed thought to ponder. A thought that takes everything we've discussed and throws it into our immediate future.
What is the thought?
If Sartre is right, that existence precedes essence for humanity, and our true human essence is entirely constructed by our free choices after we are born. What happens as we plunge headfirst into the age of artificial intelligence?
Oh, that's fascinating.
Think about the mechanics of an AI. If we create a digital consciousness whose essence, its code, its parameters, its ethical guardrails, its ultimate purpose, is quite literally programmed into it by a developer before it is ever turned on, does that machine possess a freedom? We don't.
Or have we just become the very manufacturers of the paper knife that Sartre warned us about?
Exactly. By designing a consciousness with a pre-existing blueprint, is the AI condemned to be free, or are we?
That is a staggering philosophical collision between the 20th century and tomorrow.
It is something for you to mull over as you navigate your own reality this week. Embrace the anguish of your freedom, keep questioning the blueprints handed to you, and take ownership of the ongoing radical creation of your own individual human project. And remember, the next time you feel like the floor has vanished and gravity is gone, maybe you aren't falling, maybe you're just finally free to fly.